There's a quiet battle fought every day, not with fists or shovels, but inside the dark corners of a man's own skull. It's the fight to pick up the pieces, not of broken concrete, but of a broken life. And sometimes the only tool you got left is pure, stubborn will. It's the story of how a man, even when he thinks he's got nothing left but dust in his pockets and sorrow in his heart, can still find a way to stand back up. It ain't about some miracle cure or a sudden burst of sunshine. It's about the grit you find when you're convinced you're all out of it, the discipline you build when your whole world feels like it's crumbling. Dale knew that battle better than most. 48 years old, a construction man through and through, he carried the weight of those years like a second skin. You could see it in the way his shoulders slumped slightly even when he stood straight, in the deep lines carved around his eyes and mouth that weren't just from squinting at the sun. He wasn't a big man, not in the way some guys on the crew were, but he was dense, built like an old oak stump, all muscle and bone honed by decades of heavy lifting and honest sweat. His hands, they told their own story. Calloused, scarred, knuckles swollen from old breaks and countless scrapes. They were the hands of a man who built things, who tore things down, who knew the feel of rough timber and cold steel better than he knew his own reflection sometimes. He didn't wear a wedding ring anymore, hadn't in years, but a faint, ghostly white band on his left ring finger was still visible, a permanent pale reminder of what once was. Dale was quiet, almost unnervingly so. On the job site, he wasn't one for idle chatter or swapping jokes. He'd listen, sure, his head tilted just so, absorbing everything, but his replies were always short, direct, and to the point. If you didn't know him, you might think he was gruff, maybe even a little angry, but that wasn't it. He just didn't see the need for extra words when a nod or a grunt would do. His eyes, the color of faded denim, often seemed far away, looking through you rather than at you, as if he were constantly sifting through a silent, internal ledger. There was a weariness there, a profound fatigue that ran deeper than just physical exhaustion, but beneath it, if you looked close enough, a flicker, a persistent, stubborn spark that refused to be extinguished completely. He moved with a purpose, even when that purpose felt heavy, like dragging a chain through thick mud. He was a man who worked hard, ate hard, and then you imagined just plain rested hard, trying to patch up whatever came apart during the day, whether it was a busted pipe or a troubled thought. You ever stand on a piece of ground that just won't hold? You dig down, lay your rebar, pour your concrete, but you know deep down the earth beneath it is just soft, shifty. You can build the prettiest damn house in the world on top, but if that foundation ain't solid, it's all gonna come tumbling down eventually. That's a lesson every man who's ever worked a day with his hands comes to understand about the world outside him. But the real gut punch, the one that'll truly lay you low, is when you realize that same damn principle applies to the world inside you. Your head, your own thoughts. That's the foundation no one else sees, the one you gotta dig out and shore up yourself. Because when life hits you with a wrecking ball, a divorce that shatters everything you thought was stable, an injury that takes away your livelihood, a business that crumbles like dry rot, the first thing to give way ain't the walls or the roof. That's how it was for Dale. His inner world, it had crumbled. He knew the feeling of solid ground, had built enough foundations in his 48 years to recognize when something was stable. But his own mind, his own spirit, had become a shifting, unreliable mess. He'd lived long enough in that ruin to almost forget what it felt like to stand on firm ground. Every morning, the shrill scream of his alarm would pierce the pre-dawn quiet at 4:30. Not 5, but 4:30. It wasn't a choice. It was a necessity. Another half hour meant a quicker coffee, a rushed drive, a frantic scramble to get to the site on time. There was no room for error, no slack in the line. He'd swing his feet out of bed, the cold linoleum floor of his small, modest two-bedroom house a familiar shock, and stand for a moment, letting the ache in his knees and lower back announce the start of another day. The routine was a ritual, a silent prayer to consistency. Coffee, black as sin and strong enough to wake the dead, brewed in an ancient percolator that hissed and sputtered its defiance. A quick shower, the hot water a fleeting comfort against the coming chill of the morning air. He'd pull on his work clothes, faded jeans, a worn flannel, steel-toed boots heavy with the ghosts of past projects. Each movement was economical, practiced, without joy or resentment, just the efficient motions of a man performing a necessary task. Breakfast was usually a piece of toast, maybe some instant oatmeal. He'd pack a lunch almost identical every day. A sandwich, an apple, a bag of chips. No frills, no surprises. Surprises cost money, and Dale didn't have any spare change for those. He'd pull out of his drive, the ancient pickup truck coughing to life, and join the stream of other working men heading to various construction sites around the city. Faces etched with similar weariness, minds focused on the same simple goal. Another day, another dollar. On the job site, he was a ghost among the living. He could lift, dig, hammer, and haul with the best of them. His hands, thick and calloused, knew the language of brick, mortar, and steel. He'd spent decades perfecting the art of building, of turning blueprints into solid structures. But while his body worked, his mind often wandered, or rather it drifted. Not in dreams, but in echoes. Echoes of what had been, what could have been. He'd see a young couple on a new build, pointing excitedly at where their kitchen would be, and he'd remember a time when he dreamed of building more than just a house, of building a home. A real home, not just the neat but showing signs of age and warehouse he retreated to. He'd remember the pride of his own small business, the name painted on the side of his own truck, the sense of ownership of creation. The feeling that he was building something for himself, for his future, for his daughter, Sarah. Now he was just a cog, a pair of strong hands on a payroll. Money was a constant gnawing anxiety. Every month, the pile of bills on his kitchen table seemed to multiply. Utility statements, truck payments, a modest alimony check that still felt like a punch to the gut after all these years. And then the big one, the small but persistent payments on the mountain of debt left over from his failed business. He always paid them somehow. Always. Not because he had plenty, but because he was Dale and Dale paid his debts. But it meant everything else was stripped bare. No savings, no wiggle room, just a tightrope walk from one paycheck to the next. He wasn't starving, not by a long shot, but he was always just one busted pipe or one missed shift away from real trouble. The silence of his house at night was often his greatest tormentor. It was in that quiet that the inner demons would gather, uninvited guests that knew exactly where to find the raw spots. Regret was a dull, constant ache behind his eyes, a phantom limb he'd lost but still felt. He'd replay conversations, decisions, moments when he thought he'd known best, moments that in hindsight seemed so foolish. The divorce, the bitter arguments, the slow, agonizing erosion of what he'd once thought was unbreakable. He'd often tell himself it was her fault, or the economy's fault, or bad luck's fault. Anything to deflect the blame from the man staring back at him from the dark reflection of his living room window. But deep down, he knew the truth. He had played his part. Messed up. He had failed. And then there was Sarah, his daughter, 25 now, making her own way in the world. They talked sometimes, mostly texts, quick calls. "How are you, Dad?" "Good, honey, just working." Distant but loving, like two ships passing in a fog, each knowing the other was out there but unable to truly connect. He loved her fiercely, but a heavy cloak of shame hung over that love. He'd always wanted to be more for her, a pillar, a foundation. Instead, he felt like a crumbling wall she had to tiptoe around. He carried all of this silently. Like the heavy tools in his belt or the sacks of concrete on his shoulder, it was just part of the load. He was a man who preferred to observe, to listen, to keep his own counsel. To strangers, he was gruff, withdrawn, sometimes even a little intimidating. But inside, it was a constant, exhausting battle against himself. Against the voice that told him he was a washout, a failure, that he'd missed his chance, that he was too old, too tired, too broken to ever truly rebuild. That voice was a wrecking ball of its own, far more insidious than any life could throw at him. He knew intellectually that he was in a rut. He knew he was adrift. But the mental exhaustion, the sheer weight of trying to even think about changing, felt like trying to move a mountain with a spoon. So he just kept lifting, digging, hammering, hauling. One foot in front of the other, blindly into another day. You know, sometimes a man can carry a weight so long he forgets what it feels like to stand up straight. He just gets used to the slump, the ache in his shoulders, the grinding pain in his back. He builds his whole life around that burden, like a scaffold supporting a crumbling wall, and he just keeps adding more bricks to the damn thing, even if they're just bricks of quiet despair and unspoken regret. Dale was like that. He'd been slumping for years, blindly putting one foot in front of the other, each step just another notch in the weary march. But even the strongest scaffold can't hold forever. The week it happened, the sky had been spitting a cold, indifferent rain that seeped into everything, chilling bones and dampening spirits. Dale had spent his days slogging through mud on a new foundation site, wrestling rebar into place, the metallic tang of damp earth clinging to his clothes. Every muscle screamed by quitting time, but it was the dull throb behind his eyes that truly wore him down. He came home each evening to the quiet, dark house, the air thick with the smell of old coffee and unspoken emptiness. One Tuesday, After a particularly brutal day of hauling concrete bags up a rickety ramp, he found it waiting for him. Not just the usual stack of bills on the kitchen counter, but a thick, official-looking envelope, stiff and unyielding, nestled amongst them like a predator in a flock of doves. It bore the seal of a law firm he'd come to dread, a ghost from the wreck of his small business, a constant reminder of the debts that clung to him like barnacles to a hull. He knew instinctively what it was before he even touched it. Another demand, another final notice. The legal system, he'd learned, was a tireless beast, gnawing away at the remains long after you thought you de-swept up all the bones. His fingers, thick and scarred from years of labor, fumbled with the flap. The fluorescent kitchen light, when it flickered on, seemed to cast a sickly yellow glow over the words, making them dance and blur. It was a judgment. A final, unappealable order to garnish his wages for an outstanding balance from a supplier, a debt that had survived the divorce settlement and every paltry payment he'd managed to scrape together. This wasn't just another bill. It was a stake driven through the heart of the meager buffer he'd been trying to build, that quiet, desperate hope of stashing away just enough to feel like he wasn't living hand-to-mouth. The amount wasn't astronomical, not in the grand scheme of things, but it was enough. Enough to tip him over the edge of the financial cliff he'd been clinging to for years. It was the last, cold shovelful of dirt on the grave of his dwindling financial independence. He didn't yell. He didn't curse. He just stood there, the paper trembling slightly in his grip, the blood draining from his face. A peculiar stillness settled over him, not peaceful, but the kind of stillness that precedes a great collapse. And then, as if on cue, a soft click. The kitchen light blinked, shuddered, and died. Darkness swallowed the room, absolute and immediate, like a heavy blanket dropped from above. The power, long overdue, finally cut. He could hear the faint, distant hum of the city, the drip of the rain outside, but inside his small house there was only the suffocating silence. He was alone, utterly alone, in the sudden, unexpected cold. He shuffled into the living room, guided by muscle memory, and sank onto his worn couch. The room, usually just dim, was now a cavern of shadow. He could feel the chill seeping into his bones, a mirror to the chill in his gut. He sat there in the dark, the unread judgment still clutched in his hand. Hours passed. The rain outside intensified, a steady, mournful drumming against the window pane. The shadows deepened, blurring the lines of the familiar, turning his modest home into an alien landscape. He didn't move, didn't reach for a candle, didn't even shiver, though the cold was biting now. His mind, usually so good at compartmentalizing, at shoving the painful truths into dark corners, seemed to rebel. The barriers had crumbled. His gaze drifted to the window across the room. The black pane, reflecting the faintest glimmer from a distant street lamp, became a mirror. And there he was, a man, not the man he'd been, not the man he wanted to be. This was the man he had become. 48 years old, face etched with lines of worry and exhaustion, shoulders slumped, eyes hollowed out caverns in the dim light. He saw the weary resignation, the spirit that had been ground down, the fight drained out of him. He saw a man utterly defeated, a ghost clinging to a broken life. The reflection didn't just show his face. It showed the sum total of his failures, his regrets, his missed opportunities, all staring back at him with an accusing, silent intensity. He saw the debris of a broken marriage, the phantom limb of a business he'd tried to build, the growing chasm between him and Sarah, his beautiful daughter. He saw the poor choices, the wallowing, the self-pity he disguised as quiet strength. It wasn't just the power that had been cut off. It was a circuit in his soul. He had nothing left to lose, not even the comforting illusion that things might get better on their own. When the clock on his phone, which he held dimly to avoid straining his eyes in the dark, finally showed 3 a.m., a new kind of silence fell. It was the silence of absolute solitude, the kind that presses in on you when the rest of the world is asleep and you are awake, trapped in the echo chamber of your own mind. Dale wasn't just physically alone, he was existentially alone. There was no one to call, no one to share the burden, no one to even witness this moment of profound collapse. He had built his isolation brick by brick, and now he was trapped within its walls. The brutal honesty began to surface, unbidden, unwelcome, yet undeniable. He saw, for the first time without flinching, the chaotic mess his mind had become. It wasn't just external circumstances, it was him. He had allowed the despair to become his companion, the blame a constant mantra, the self-pity a thick, suffocating blanket. He saw how he had let his thoughts run wild, tearing down any nascent flicker of hope, sabotaging any chance of upward momentum. He had convinced himself he was too old, too tired, too broken. He saw the man in the window not as a victim, but as an accomplice to his own downfall. His life, laid bare in the ghostly light of his phone screen, felt like a crumbling ruin, not a single brick sound, not a single beam true. The raw truth hit him with the force of a physical blow. He had allowed himself to drift, to surrender to the current of his own despair until he was completely adrift, broken beyond repair. The exhaustion wasn't just physical, it was mental, spiritual. He was empty, hollowed out. He had reached the bottom, and there was nothing left but the cold, hard rock of his own devastating self-realization. He had let his mind, the one thing he supposedly controlled, become his greatest enemy. He had let his mind, the one thing he supposedly controlled, become his greatest enemy. And in that dark, quiet, empty room, something finally snapped. Not with a bang, but with the weary sigh of a man who could simply take no more. A silent, unshakable whisper rose from the depths of his exhaustion, a voice that was not his despair, but something older, harder, more fundamental. Enough. It wasn't a question, not a plea. It was a declaration. A line drawn in the dust of his failure. Enough of the blame. Enough of the wallowing. Enough of letting his own head beat him down harder than any foreman ever could. He didn't know what came next. He had no grand plan, no sudden flash of insight, no magic answer for the mountains of debt or the hollow ache in his chest. All he knew, with a certainty that chilled him even in the dark, was that he absolutely, fundamentally, could not continue this way. This spiral into nothingness, fueled by his own chaotic thoughts, had to stop. Right now, the floor was cold beneath his bare feet when he finally pushed himself up. Not because he felt better, but because staying there, lost in the self-inflicted misery, was no longer an option. His body ached, his eyes stung from the dryness, but for the first time in what felt like years, there was a flicker, tiny, almost imperceptible, of something akin to purpose. Day one? The alarm clock, an old, reliable thing, shrieked at 4:45 a.m. Dale flinched, his hand automatically reaching to silence it, but this time he didn't just roll over. This time, as the first tendrils of consciousness snaked into his brain, bringing with them the familiar chorus of doubt and dread, what's the point? Another wasted day. You're still a failure, Dale. He did something different. He lay there for a long moment, listening to the voices, the relentless, insidious whispers that had governed his mornings for so long. He felt the weight of them, the suffocating blanket of despair trying to pull him back into the mattress, back into the dark cave of his own mind. Every fiber of his being screamed to just shut his eyes, let the day happen without him, surrender to the mental quicksand. But he remembered the dark reflection, the silent enough, and he thought about a wall, a good wall. You don't just throw mortar and brick together. You lay the first one true, you level it, you check it. You make damn sure it's right, because every single brick after it depends on that first one. And the first brick in this new wall, he realized, wasn't going to be some grand gesture or a sudden change in circumstance. It was going to be the very next thought he chose to entertain. With a groan that seemed to pull from the deepest parts of his weary soul, Dale pushed himself up to a sitting position on the edge of the bed. It was a monumental effort. His head throbbed, his muscles protested, and the mental chatter was still there, louder now. See, this is stupid. Nothing's going to change. Just go back to sleep. He ignored it. He didn't fight it, didn't try to silence it with force. He just didn't engage with it. Instead, he focused on the rough texture of the blanket beneath his fingers. He focused on the cool air on his skin. He focused on the simple, undeniable fact that his feet were on the floor. It wasn't profound. It wasn't heroic. It was just one small, deliberate action chosen over the path of least resistance. It was the first mental brick laid with painstaking, agonizing effort. He stood up. One foot in front of the other, he walked to the bathroom. The mirror showed the same tired face, the same haunted eyes, but something was subtly different. He didn't avert his gaze this time. He looked. And then he splashed cold water on his face, the shock a sharp, welcome sting. It felt like he was waking up not just his body, but something deeper inside him. The battle wasn't won, not by a long shot. But the first shot had been fired, and it came from within. That first day, the one after the dark night, was a grind. Every minute felt like he was pushing against an invisible wall. The mental chatter, the old familiar voices, they didn't just disappear. They were still there, whispering, sometimes shouting, trying to drag him back into the mud. This is exhausting. What's the point? You'll just mess it up again. Dale heard them. He felt the weight of them pressing down, but he didn't give them a seat at the table. He just let them shout like dogs barking down the street. Annoying, but not his problem. He went to work. The trowel felt heavier, each brick laid seemed to drain a little more out of him than usual. It wasn't the physical labor, he was used to that. It was the constant, conscious effort to keep his mind from wandering to the bleak canyons of regret, to the sharp edges of what-ifs. He focused on the mortar, the even spread, the precise placement of the brick. He focused on the sun on his neck, the grit under his boots. He laid brick after brick, not thinking about the whole wall, not even about the whole course. Just this brick. Then the next. By the time he got home, the exhaustion was bone-deep, a different kind of tired than he was used to. It wasn't just physical, it was soul-tired from the internal war. The temptation to just collapse on the couch, grab a beer, and let his mind go dark was almost overwhelming. It was a familiar comfort, a soft, destructive escape. But then he remembered the window, the defeated reflection, the quiet promise. Instead of the beer, he picked up a broom. The floor was clean enough, hadn't seen proper grime in weeks, but the act of sweeping, the rhythmic motion, was a simple, tangible thing. It was a brick. Not a big one, not a load-bearing one, but a brick nonetheless. He felt the tension in his shoulders ease just a fraction. He made a simple dinner, ate it slowly, consciously chewing each bite, not letting his mind race ahead. Then he went to bed. Sleep came, heavy and dreamless, a temporary reprieve. Day 3 was harder. The novelty of the decision had worn off, replaced by the stark reality of the effort required. Waking up wasn't a moment of clarity, it was a struggle against the sticky embrace of the mattress. His mind, rested from sleep, came back with renewed vigor, throwing old failures in his face like handfuls of dirt. Remember Sarah? How you let her down? Remember the business? The money? Each memory was a barb designed to hook him back into the familiar cycle of self-flagellation. He almost didn't make it out of bed. His eyes were open, staring at the ceiling, but his body felt glued down. He could feel the old pull, the gravitational force of despair. He knew if he just stayed there, eventually he'd drift back to sleep and the day would be lost. The silence in the room was deafening, amplifying the accusations in his head. Then he heard a distant garbage truck rumble past, the mundane sound cutting through the mental noise. It was a small, external anchor. He remembered the feeling of cold water on his face. He pictured the roughness of the blanket. He didn't feel like getting up. He didn't want to, but he had made a deal. Not with anyone else, but with the man in the dark reflection. He swung his legs over the side of the bed. It felt like lifting lead weights. He felt a tremor in his hands, not from physical exertion, but from the sheer force of will required. Fighting himself, a war without a battlefield, just the inside of his skull. He made it to the bathroom, splashed water, made coffee, went to work. Each small act was a triumph, a whispered no to the voices telling him to quit. By the end of the first week, he felt like he was constantly swimming upstream. There were moments of exasperation where he just wanted to scream, to lash out at the unfairness of it all. He'd catch himself clenching his jaw so tight his teeth ached. He'd walk past a liquor store and feel an almost magnetic pull, a craving that was less about alcohol and more about forgetting, about silencing the relentless mental noise for a few hours. One evening, after a particularly grueling day on site where a complicated beam placement went wrong and cost them hours, Dale came home utterly depleted. He sat in his worn armchair, the house silent around him, and felt the familiar dread creeping back in. See? It's all still crap. You're just postponing the inevitable. He closed his eyes, and the darkness behind his eyelids felt suffocating. He almost gave in. He reached for his phone, a reflex to scroll mindlessly to numb himself. His finger hovered over the contact for Sarah, then paused. No, he couldn't burden her. Not with this. Not yet. He sat there unmoving for what felt like an hour, trapped in the mental quicksand. The temptation was to just wallow, to let the self-pity consume him. He could almost feel the tendrils of it wrapping around his ankles, pulling him down. But then a faint, almost imperceptible spark. A memory of the lesson. Ain't no magic cure. You just gotta get up, figure out the next small thing, and do it. What was the next small thing? He looked around his living room at the dust motes dancing in the last sliver of sunlight through the window. It wasn't a grand project. It wasn't solving all his financial woes or mending old wounds. It was just the dust. With a sigh that felt like it carried all the weight of the week, he slowly stood up. He walked to the kitchen, found a damp cloth, and started wiping down the coffee table. One swipe, then another. He wasn't thinking about a sparkling house or a new life. He was thinking about the grain of the wood under his hand, the dampness of the cloth, the quiet scrape as he picked up the invisible motes of dust. It was painful, it was hard, but it was doing. And in that small, almost defiant act, he laid another brick, reinforcing the wall of his newfound mental discipline, one agonizing, deliberate movement at a time. He wasn't out of the woods, not by a long shot, but he was still walking. And for now, that was enough. The following morning, the weight of the world hadn't lifted. Dale still felt it, a heavy shroud pressing down, making every movement an effort. The dust he'd wiped the night before was a distant memory, irrelevant in the face of the mountain he still had to climb. His mind, the persistent enemy, began its old tricks, whispering doubts, reminding him of every failure, every broken promise to himself. What was the point? One clean coffee table doesn't pay the bills. It doesn't fix anything. He fought it. He pulled on his work boots, the laces feeling like chains, and reminded himself, just the next thing, shower. The water was cold at first, a shock to the system, but he stayed under it, let it clear his head if only for a moment. Then coffee, black, strong, bitter, a small ritual of defiance. Days turned into a grinding battle. Day 3, his body ached from work, his mind from the constant internal wrestling. He almost just flopped onto the couch, let the TV swallow him whole. But then he saw the small pile of dirty dishes in the sink. Next brick. He washed them one by one, the hot water scalding his hands, scrubbing away not just the grime, but a sliver of the mental fog. By day 7, the old pattern reasserted itself. He came home, exhausted, and just sat. The dust motes seemed to mock his previous efforts. He felt the familiar pull of inertia, the comfortable despair. See, you can't change. You always fall back. The voice was loud, convincing. He almost gave in, almost let the takeout menu win. But then a stubborn refusal hardened in his gut. No, not today. He got up, walked to the kitchen, and opened the fridge. There was a half-eaten container of leftover chili, cold but food. He ate it, standing up, a victory as small and significant as a single perfectly laid brick. He didn't go to bed feeling triumphant, but he didn't go to bed feeling completely defeated either. He just went to bed knowing he'd fought. Weeks passed, a slow, methodical march through the swamp of his own making. Dale learned to identify the whispers of self-pity, the shouts of regret, and to consciously, deliberately turn his attention to the task at hand. If his mind tried to drift to the ruined business, he'd focus on the rhythmic swing of his hammer. If it started replaying the divorce, he'd count the bricks in the course he was laying. It was like building a mental muscle, flexing it against resistance day after day. He stumbled, he failed on occasion, a forgotten chore, a lapse into an old habit, but he always picked himself up. He wasn't aiming for perfection, he was aiming for persistence. Around the 3rd week, something subtle began to shift. It wasn't a sudden explosion of joy, not a lightning bolt from the heavens. It was quieter, like the slow dawn after a long night. At the job site, Billy, one of the younger guys, noticed. "Hey, Dale," he'd said one morning. "You been looking sharper lately? New haircut?" Dale just grunted, not understanding, but later caught his reflection in a muddy puddle. His eyes, though still tired, held a different glint, a spark of something beyond mere endurance. He was more present, less lost in his own head. He started packing his own lunch, a simple sandwich, an apple, avoiding the greasy food truck that used to be his default. His clothes, though still worn, were cleaner pressed. His small house, once a battlefield of regret, began to feel like a sanctuary. He wasn't just maintaining it, he was caring for it. He even found himself humming a tune while doing laundry, a simple melody he hadn't realized he knew, a small rebellion against the silence. One evening, he actually dialed Sarah. Not to unload, not to complain, but just to ask how she was. He listened, really listened. He told her about a particularly tough wall he'd finished at work, how good it felt to see it plumb and true. She mentioned she was thinking about repainting her apartment. "What color?" he asked, genuinely curious. It was a simple conversation, but for Dale, it felt like bridging a canyon with a strong, new cable. He started small, fixed a leaky faucet, patched a small hole in the drywall, planted a few simple flowers in a dusty pot on his porch. Each small act was a testament to his renewed mental discipline, a visible manifestation of the internal foundations he was rebuilding. He wasn't the man he once was, not yet anyway, but he certainly wasn't the broken man he had been. He was still Dale, the construction worker with the calloused hands, but the landscape of his mind, once a crumbling ruin, was now a site of careful, deliberate construction. He wasn't waiting for life to get better, he was actively, painstakingly making it so. "Ain't no magic cure, you know," Dale said one blustery afternoon to Billy as they laid a footer for a new addition. He wiped sweat from his brow with the back of a gloved hand. "You just gotta get up, figure out the next small thing, and do it. Then the next. Don't let your head tell you it's too much. That voice, it's a liar, one brick at a time, even if it hurts like hell. Especially when it hurts. And that, friends, is the truth of it. We all carry weights, we all face crumbling walls in our lives. But there's a quiet power in the man who understands that a life isn't rebuilt by grand gestures or sudden epiphanies, but